Imagine a winding path where every twist reveals not just clues about your child's world, but startling reflections of your own. How do you navigate a map that's both familiar and foreign at the same time? In this episode, I sit down with Matt Gupwell to explore the surprising twists and turns of late diagnosis, how a parent's quest for answers can become a mirror reflecting hidden aspects of their own identity, and how this dual perspective can reshape both personal and professional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the show today. As many of you know, I started my journey into neurodiversity with my son's diagnosis back in 2009. And this would lead me on this trajectory for my own discovery of ADHD and other neurodivergencies. And with this revelation, it added this new layer of understanding to my work and how I can help others. But it turns out I'm really not alone in this experience at all. Today, I'm joined by Matt Gupwell, who also shares a very similar story. His journey started with his son's autism diagnosis and followed with his own late diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And I think having this dual perspective, both as a parent of autistic and neurodivergent children and being neurodivergent individuals, really shapes how we work and our advocacy efforts. So welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me.
I've been following your work for quite a while, and I was really excited when I reached out and said, join me on my podcast, and you agreed.
Oh, that's lovely. I always get vaguely worried when people say I've been following you and go, oh no, and what were you thinking? But no, it's great. It's good. It's good to join you.
And so, I've already started kind of leading us down this path of this living as neurodivergent and raising neurodivergent children, but like the starting point of raising these children. And so what I'd really like to start exploring is there's this concept of late diagnosis. And for some people, they don't understand how this comes to be. But I think when you have parents and you're going through the diagnosis process, you start to hear things and you start to reflect on your own childhood a bit. So I'd like you to share how you came about, like starting to think about your own issues later in life and how that might have affected your understanding of your own son's diagnoses.
It's really interesting. The first word that came to my mind then was denial, and I'll explain why. So my oldest son, Oz, was diagnosed early 2009. So interesting, exactly the same time frames, right? And I really remember his appointment being sat with a pediatric consultant saying, yeah, meets all the markers for this thing called Asperger's syndrome, form of autism, and it's likely genetic. So, and the question was framed as, and so where would you suppose, to my wife and I, where would you suppose that may come from? And we literally pointed at each other and kind of went, it's your brother, it's your dad, it's your mom, it's your aunt. Your uncle's always been extravagant. Not once did it occur to us it may be a bit closer to home, right? Not even close to. And I kind of, now I look back, I'm sure there must have been a wry smile on that consultant's face going, you have no idea, do you? But they kind of left it. We got the diagnosis, but like you, by the sounds of it, you get that news. And back then, it was Asperger's here. It was this thing of this high functioning, awful term when you think about it, autism. So we went away and went, what the hell is that? Because our son, whilst he had struggles and was having issues, sure, definitely didn't meet the Rain Man criteria, didn't meet the, what we thought autism was. So we went away, we learned, we read, we studied, we met with other parents, we joined advocacy groups. We were just trying to upskill, boost our knowledge. And then his brother ended up with the same diagnosis. So there was sort of 15 months between them. So his younger brother then went through the same process. And that was the first time I realized how different people can present with the same diagnosis. So the difference between my oldest son and my youngest son at assessment was phenomenal. You know, it was kind of like, well, hold on, he didn't do anything that he's doing, but the same question was asked. But it was framed as, look, this is likely direct genetics, which means there's every chance this has been passed down through one of you. So who is it more likely to be? And at that point, we knew a little, not a lot, and we were kind of looking at the old triangle of needs, right? And kind of going, well, based on what my wife used to say about school, she struggled more socially, never quite got friends. Maybe it's more her, but we weren't convinced. And then it took until, probably 2013, 2014, and we met an American author on a UK book tour called, I'm sure you'll be aware of Jennifer Cook O'Toole, right? Who I think is just this wonderful human. And she came over doing a book tour for her Asper Kids books, as they were known then. And she sat and she actually spoke about her life as a late diagnosed, there's that term female. And after about 2 hours, my wife looked at me, sort of burst into tears and said, oh my God, she's just described me. Does that mean I've got autism? And so we kind of hung around. Bless Jennifer, she gave us about half an hour of her time, probably desperate to get to the hotel or the bar. I was like, look, I can't diagnose you, but if you resonate, it's certainly worth looking into. And we went away with this kind of pretty concrete agreement that fitted, that answered a lot of questions. At this point, I was still 100% completely normal as far as I was concerned. I was like, yay, told you it wasn't me. Fine, all good, right? And so that fit. We never got a formal clinical diagnosis from my wife. She was a stay-at-home mom raising 2 neurodivergent kids. So kind of like there was no point to that, really. We both agreed. We just accepted that as fact. And then in the continuing learning piece, I then went to another full-day seminar with a guy called Tony Atwood, Professor Tony Atwood, who runs Atwood and Garnett events, right? Okay, so there's that, not a familiarity. And again, just the most wonderful, knowledgeable guy at the time. And he was doing a talk about how to support your younger autistic children. It was all like social and friends. Now, he, at the time, I think, was living in Perth, certainly in Australia. And as soon as I booked, I had a very different job at the time. I wasn't doing this. I was a full-time entertainer, circus skills tutor, right? Which meant part of my job predominantly was circus skills teaching. I was teaching everyone of all ages, day in, day out, to walk tightropes, ride unicycles, but predominantly to juggle. And I'd got it in my head by then that I think I can really change the outcomes of autistic kids through circus skills, because I'd proven it through clubs I was running. I'd got evidence, and I badgered this guy every week for 3 months with an email telling him about this idea. And he eventually sort of caved and said, we'll meet at the conference, at lunch, be there. I'll give you 10 minutes. Great. And I walked up to this lunch thing full of confidence. He said, would you like a coffee? I said, no. He said, you're having one. Right. And took a coffee. And then, to paraphrase, he kind of said, don't speak, just listen. He said, through everything you've demonstrated, everything you've overshared, I would say you have one of the most spectacularly undiagnosed cases of ADHD I've ever seen in somebody that didn't know. And I really recommend you go and find out what that means to you. And I go, no, I know what ADHD is. That's not me. I wasn't that. I said, no, really. And this was really early, right? So a lot of the online have I got things weren't as available as they are. So he gave us some paper forms and the scoring criteria. He said, normally a clinician administers this, but I trust that you're sensible enough. You ask your wife these questions and vice versa. Let me know. And lo and behold, she was off the charts with Asperger's. And I mean, I got full marks and some. I was gold medal standard ADHD. And I'm like, oh, okay. And at that point, I just went, oh, that's why. That makes sense. Yeah, great. Got that. Cool. But because in my head, everything was going okay-ish with work, I had this weird career where no 2 days were really the same. I was okay with it. I started talking in schools. I started talking at, scout camps and everything about ADHD, about autism. I was this mouthpiece for advocacy. And now I could sort of say it's me as well. I look back now and think some of the things I was saying then horrify me. And it saddens me when I see the same tropes and the same things being said now, but I get why. Different conversation, I guess. And I did nothing about it. And that was sort of really from 2015 until 2019. I had a spectacularly bad year at work. I'd gone full depressed ADHD and worse mode. I'd ruined my own business single-handedly. I mean, I had torn down everything that I'd built up because essentially I was bored and frustrated.
Burned out.
Right? Yeah. And then when I got turned down for hosting an event I had no rights to host, was never even in the running for, it triggered a full-scale emotional breakdown, nervous breakdown, and kind of sobbed on the sofa in front of my wife. And she got my parents on the phone as well. And, they're divorced, so they live apart, but still really close. And I remember them saying, what's going on? I said, I can't cope anymore. I can't do this anymore. I can't be happy about this because why is everyone else better than me, got more than me, achieving more than me, XXXXX. And I said, I just think I need to know whether it really is this thing called ADHD. And here's the misinformation that I had that I still see today. My thought process was I need a diagnosis because I know there's medication and I'm told it can make it all go away. How little did I know? But to their credit, I got a private diagnosis just at the start of 2020, which meant just as COVID hit, I was in titration, which was not a good time to be titrated on anything. And that was really the start of a whole new thing because I thought I got autism. I thought I got Asperger's. I thought I'd kind of got ADHD. I knew nothing. And I've learned more since then, really, about myself than I ever did before. But now I can look back and go, oh my gosh, the signs were all there. they were there in big flashing neon letters going, doo, 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 doo. It was just me that couldn't see them, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that whether it's late diagnosis or if you're the parent of somebody, it's the anxiety behind all the interactions that if you're an adult with ADHD, you think everybody feels this way. And because you only, like when we talk about lived experience, I think it's a good thing, but it's also a dangerous thing because that means you know how your brain perceives the situation. You know how you react. And what's worse is if you have ADHD and don't know you have ADHD, you're going to think that people experience the level of anxiety that you do, and they don't. And that's why it seems like other people are doing it easier because they're wired differently than you. They actually aren't freaking out at the same level. And it's not to say that typical people don't have stress at work or don't get nervous before a presentation, but it's a more pervasive, like people with ADHD are more likely to have ants, automatic negative thoughts. They're more prone to burnout because they think what they're feeling is typical, they kind of either squash it down, or I see a lot of hyperverbalism in our grouping. I'm one of them. And we talk things out a lot, which also isn't a typical thing. So, most people with ADHD that I know have been told they are candid, but not in a positive way, right? People thank you. I can tell you're passionate. Also learned that that's not a positive word when people say you're passionate about something. But then it does make sense that these are also the people that are change agents. They're advocates because high sense of justice, right? So there is a positive to it, but it's driven by this like desire to like kind of stop the agitation swirl inside. Like you see a problem, nobody's fixing it, so now you're compelled to go.
Yeah. It's, do you know, it's really funny. I was having a conversation with somebody only last night about this, and now I think about my dad is, after 3 years after my diagnosis, of his own volition said, look, Matt, I know I've had ADHD all my life. It's just that I had a support network. I learned to cope in my way, right? That's a big thing for somebody who's in their mid-70s to kind of admit. But I often think about something he used to say when he was probably my age and younger. He was a really successful salesman in IT and sales manager and sales director of some of the biggest IT firms on the planet, right? He excelled, but with a team around him. He had this, I've been using this phrase recently, he had his pit crew, right? But the one thing he always used to say was like, before side hustles were a thing, he said, do you know, one day I'm going to start a business called Stuff. Okay, what's Stuff? It's all those ideas I have that I just need to get down because there's a million in these. And he said, the only problem with every idea I have is at the point I have the idea, someone's already done it. Someone's already got there and had that idea and made it happen. And now I look at that, somebody said exactly that in the same words last night, right? I can have the ideas, I just can't get it over the line. I can't get it started. And I think it's just that cyclone of thoughts, that cyclone of, you talk about change agents. Yes, but it's also being able to make the change happen. And look, I know from my part, without my pit crew, that ain't me. Left to my own devices, I'll have all the ideas and they will be amazing. Nothing's happening. Nothing's getting done without somebody helping, without somebody checking in on me, without me being open to the idea that there are things that this wiring just means I am not great at. I was sacked from a job because I couldn't keep an A4 manual diary. And it was a really important part of a job. It was in event management. I needed the diary. I couldn't do it. And that was one of the reasons I ended up being sacked. And I still cannot manage a diary like that. It fills me with the biggest anxiety on the planet to even think about it. So I use AI to do it for me. I use tools that we now have to do it for me. But there are so many people who, and it's this horrible thought process I think that I hear so often with people I mentor and when I'm teaching, people who say, I could be so good if, but getting the support to enable the if is the difficult bit, is the hard bit. It's the hard bit to ask for. It's the hard bit to explain. It's the bit that people don't understand. And there's something really soul destroying about that, which is why I do what I do, which is why I, predominantly I educate businesses on how to support people. And I've got to this point where I used to be like a lot of people in our space as educators. I was very focused on the label. I was very focused on almost the clinical definition of what it meant to present as ADHD or autistic and how that might show up in the workplace. And now I've realized that's not what's important. What's important is we're supporting people. And everyone's interpretation of ADHD is different. Everyone's understanding of their ADHD is at a different place. As a manager, no one needs to be a clinician. I mean, unless you're in a clinical practice, you need to be an understanding of, so you're struggling. What is it you're struggling with? How might we be able to support you? It doesn't matter whether that's executive function, ADHD, anxiety. It's what's the need? And it shouldn't come with judgment, and it shouldn't come with this expectation of, if you're so incapable, then you're in the wrong job. That's awful. It should come with, okay, let's see what we can do, right? Let's see how we can help. And by the way, the first thing we try probably isn't going to be the one that works, but we're going to have to go through an iteration of ideas until we get to the one that works. And that's okay, right? But it's got very little to do with clinical knowledge or academic knowledge of this stuff. It's got to do with what's that person in front of you presenting. If we can get there, we've got a chance. I firmly believe that. But going through the same process of you, of trying to make sense of, understand your own children, seeing them thrive, seeing them struggle, seeing them, at the best and the worst, and then going, that's why, and reflecting it on yourself. I understand why lots of people, and I've been guilty of it as well, lots of people get very, very bombastic, and there's lots of hyperbole, and there's lots of very sort of almost dangerous but finite statements about it's this. Autism is this, right? It can't be, not for everyone, and look, it's why I balk when people say I've been following you online, because I go through waves of being really good, managing myself, team around me, and then waves that I've had for the past sort of 8 weeks because of an injury where the ADHD and the anxiety and depression comes back, and I start posting in a very different way online. I start sharing my opinions in a very different way online, and I get more argumentative, and I get bombastic, and I get hyperbolic, and I get argumentative, right, and defensive. And it's only when I step out of that I realize the reason I get that is because when I feel less abled, and it was a physical injury that made me feel that on this occasion, it reminds me of how rubbish I felt for so many years, and how much harder I felt I had to work to achieve, to prove, to demonstrate that I could, and how many failures I had in comparison to my peers. And that's what drives that for me, that presentation. And I come out the other side and go, oh, I wish I could just pull the plug on the internet for those few weeks, but, it kind of is part of work. So I'm very upfront about it. I've apologized. I've shared information about it this week saying, look, this is what's been going on. Hey, I'm okay with that. I accept that. But I can then look at other people and go, I get why people are so passionate, but why that comes across as angry.
Right.
Or feeling bullied or othered, or like the world doesn't understand. And I understand all of those things. And I understand the passion behind it.
Right.
I feel my aim now is to help them, those people feeling that way, accept who they are in themselves, so that they can then find a better way of expressing their needs that isn't so based in, there's no point asking because it's not going to happen anyway.
Right. To kind of get into that like negative spiral.
Yeah. And it's fast, right?
It's an interesting thing because you were talking about how a lot of neurodiversity and autism programming, especially with businesses, they want to hear about the diagnoses. And like you, I will say these are conditions that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella, and that's about all I'll give them. And someone will be like, well, how do they manifest it? But it's not really what's important. What's important is we're having a conversation, and I really want you to think about, why is it that you would be willing to accommodate somebody if they told you you were autistic, but not somebody who just told you they needed help? That is a problem to me, because that means you think less than of that person, and you may not realize it. But if you, and I've seen it online where someone's like, well, if I knew you were dyslexic, I wouldn't have made fun of how you spelled something. Ooh, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. And so when I work with clients, they're like, but if I was talking with somebody, how would I know if it's just like they don't want to do it, or if it's a disability? And it made me so happy when the HR person in the room, who's talked to me many times before the session, she goes, that doesn't matter. It's the whole idea of, we want you to know these conditions exist so that you, in your mind, that kind of is leaning towards an ableistic view of people, which is fine. And I don't want to talk about ableism, and I never do in a big session like that. But we need to focus on, if somebody says, I'm not good at keeping project plans. Like, by the way, project managers, that's a real job, like with real skills that we can write a requisition for. So why does every person have to have that skill set? Or executive functioning? Like, that's an administrative assistance job. And so I said, we need to think about, why is the CEO, it's completely okay if they were meeting with some big regulator to have their attorney and a CPA and their business manager. They don't fully speak for themselves, but you go down 3 tiers in the company, and now that person not being able to be all those people at once is a problem. I go, it's a skewed view on entitlement. Has nothing to do with capabilities. Nobody's good at everything. We have so got to stop that. But that's what the haves and the have-nots have. The haves have 80 assistants and never speak for themselves unless they want to. And the have-nots are supposed to be everything. And if you're not, you're deficient.
Yeah, and it's the underlying feeling of failure that gives people.
They make when they think
there's I can't live up to this. I can't do this. I'm not that person. So, I see it so many times when people talk about how many jobs they've had and how many jobs they've been fired from. I talk about it an awful lot. And I look back on it now and I can see this all happened before I knew anything about myself. I had 35 full-time jobs and was sacked 30 times. Right? You would think the evidence in that taught me something. What it taught me at the time was, I don't get this. The world is against me. It's not fair. This sucks. But I never stopped trying. I never gave up, right? And when I talk to people about it now, very often I see people leaving jobs because they think, I just can't live up to that. And if I ask for help, and I don't want to say it's my autism or my ADHD, I'm not going to get it anyway. Exactly what you said. I don't understand why we have to attach a label to give someone support, because the biggest sort of oxymoron in all of this that I find when we talk reasonable adjustments, right, particularly this conversation, the biggest thing that rattles my cage here is when someone braves themselves and says, I need support, and an adjustment's put in place and it works, and other people who may not have the same needs see it and go, I mean, I'd quite like that as well.
I could use that. Yeah.
Right? I could use that. And it then is enabled. And it's amazing how much that helps everyone. Right? It's amazing how many reasonable adjustments are just good for everyone. It's just, it takes that one person to struggle, to ask, to change. Wouldn't it be far better to have conversations earlier on that say, so how is this work environment? How are we finding that? How do you find it when you've got a hot desk? How do you find it when the AC's above your head? Right? Those kind of conversations could mitigate anyone feeling like, if I say this, I am at risk of losing my job. Right. If I ask for help, this is going to be exit time, rather than, well, actually, they're just thinking really logically, right? I don't understand why we can't get there sooner, but that's what I'm pushing for and advocating for.
People appreciate how risky it is to ask for a reasonable accommodation. I'm not as familiar with your side of the pond, but I know on my side of the house, the employer determines what's reasonable. And so what I tell employers is, you are asking your employee to put themselves out there, not just to disclose the disability, which to me is really none of your business, but then what if what they ask you deem as unreasonable? Did they not just give you fodder for a performance issue that will then result in termination at some point? Because if I tell you I will not be successful without X and you deny me that support, didn't you just set up the construct for me to fail?
Yeah.
And the light bulbs, you could see it going on. I'm like, that's what you're asking of people. Yeah. You're asking for them to disclose that without a ladder, Theresa can't reach a tall shelf. And when you deny me the ladder, then I can't do my job. And then I'm going to be at stage right.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. The amount of jobs I ended up leaving under this wonderful HR phrase of capability versus ability. And actually all it took would have been understanding, from my part, I didn't know then, but understanding and an adjustment that would have made the world of difference, right? That's it. But we still are in this culture, unfortunately. And this side of the pond, it's not so dissimilar. I think what I see too often is because there's lots of talk about, let's say, ADHD, right? Mm-hmm. There is a lot of talk about it. We've now got people who think they know what that means for other people, and they think that they know what will work for ADHD rather than what will work for Matt, who's got ADHD. Right? So it's this thing of, and I've seen it too many times, well, we gave Steve noise-cancelling earbuds and that worked for him, so why hasn't it worked for you? Because that ain't my issue. Great for Steve. Yay, Steve. What I'm saying is I can't keep an A4 diary planner. That's got nothing to do with noise-cancelling headphones. That's got to do with something very different. So can we not project what you think you know and listen to what I'm sharing and figure out what may work? Now, we have various systems over here, and I'm not sure what it's like with healthcare and over there in the States. We have the occupational health get involved and systems like Access to Work in the UK, where people can be helped to understand what may help them. But it still ultimately then comes back to organisations agreeing to those adjustments.
Yeah.
Saying, okay, we are willing to try. And the bizarre bit, the bit that really floors me, is when a reasonable adjustment is put in place and people think it's like a magic wand, right? Right, we've given you that, ta-da, everything's good now. Whoa, no, I said it may help. So how about we agree a review period and we review it regularly, and we might need to tweak it or change it or do something to it that makes it work more efficiently. But it isn't just, oh, you asked for one thing, you got it, now go away and never darken our doors again. Stop moaning. It's, we're trying, but we are facing a lot of that. And what does that do for people? They see someone else go through that and go, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to ask because I know what happened to them. Really? Is that where we're at? Is that understanding? Is that helpful? I don't think it is. But all of those things I see come from more often a place of misplaced assumption of understanding rather than lack of understanding. And I think that's worse. I think that's more damaging. You know, I don't know about you. If you sit in a room with 30 people, I always start my sessions with this. I say, please don't call me an expert. I'm not an expert. I'm just a mouthpiece. Let's start with how much you know. Raise your hand if you are connected to or know someone that you work with who you believe identifies as having a condition that would fall under this umbrella term neurodivergent. Right? In a room of 30, on average, at least half, if not 3/4 of the room will raise their hand. I've had it in sessions where everyone's raised their hand. At which point I say, so well, the point I'm trying to make here is you already have some knowledge and you could project what you know of those people onto everything I tell you. What we need to do is realize that's their experience. You know, you said it at the start and I say it every time I teach. If I tell you about my neurodivergence, all you know about is my experience. That's it. What good is that for your organization? It might give you a bit of awareness, but it isn't going to tell you how to support everyone. So I'll tell you about everyone I've worked with, everyone I've supported, what I know from research, everything else. But what I really want you to understand is the only way to support people and know what they need, ask them. Make them feel safe to have conversations about what support they need. And I don't care whether you need to know whether it's ADHD or not. You don't. You need to know what might make you feel more confident in your role, and are we able to enable that? That's easier, isn't it? That should come with less risk.
It's good management.
Funny that's how I was taught as well.
It's good management.
Isn't it though? Strange that we're similar ages, maybe I'm 50 and I say these things and think, I just knew that when I first got my first management job was probably around about 26 years old, and I knew that, right? I was aware of that. I'd been managed well. And yet now we're having to reiterate this to a younger generation. And actually, that's unfair to young people. I get shut down for that. Sometimes it's to younger people. I also find that there are people at the other end And it's that great old, I always think of Statler and Waldorf when I think of this. We've always done it that way. It's always been done that way. You're always terrible. And then when they make the changes, no, that was amazing. It's wonderful. We love it. Really?
Right.
You think? But it needs someone to pull those conversations together and to join the two sides. You know, it's why whenever I do consultancy, I will not work with a company that doesn't give me at least 20 minutes with the senior leadership team first. Because I want them to understand why. I need them to understand the financial cost and the human cost and the business cost of why they can't ignore this and what right looks like before we do any awareness, before we do any manager training. Because without buy-in from the very top of the tree, it all falls apart anyway, right?
Agree.
That's tough to get every time. But the companies that agree to it, I think their results end up being better because at least you've got buy-in. You've got people at the top going, yes, we understand why, and we know we can't ignore it.
Yeah. I think what's the most interesting, besides all of it, and what I think people need to understand is if you're a parent with an autistic or ADHD person, you feel like you have a lot to learn, you know, and you learn about your children, and then you learn that there's people other than you, and you're trying to figure it out. I hope as you hear Matt and I talking, the reason why late diagnosis is a thing is 20, 30 years ago, 40, 50 with our ages, just call each other out there. It existed, but it was like Cantor's autism was being diagnosed. Asperger's was like, I have a cousin with Cantor's autism. But there are things that it wasn't talked about. It was misdiagnosed. So like if you were ever reviewed for potentially having a learning disability, but then they send you back to the classroom because they're like, you're not really learning disabled, but you were different. Couldn't quite figure out why you did good in this subject and this year. If you had like this weird asynchronous experience, you might have just been before we knew what we knew. And then the other thing that I hope people really heard you say, and I want employers to understand, is sometimes you'll have somebody that's late diagnosed or diagnosed. They know they have needs, but they may know they need help, but they may not actually know what they need help with. Like just because it's like being diabetic, that doesn't mean you know what drugs you should be prescribing yourself. So it is a conversation. And one of the most interesting things that I hear like with recruiters is they're like, well, if they tell us the accommodations, we can make them. Well, if I've never been in your workplace and I've never worked with that manager, how would I even know what I'm going to need till I get there? I haven't met the team. I haven't seen how they worked. You know, I know what the job description says, but does that transpire to reality when I get there on day one?
You're right. And there's a couple of things I would say. I was thinking about this morning. There's an old business term, I suppose it's still used, about SWOT analysis, you know, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I kind of think it would be great if I was starting a role, if somebody said, can you just do a SWOT on yourself, just as a person, based on your career history, right? Tell me where your strengths are. Tell me where you think you can thrive, and tell me where you think or you've previously needed a bit of support, because that's like a jumping off point, right? That's to say, okay, so I needed this in my last role. Is that possible here? I can't see an issue with that. I think that would be a much better thing to do it early than to wait for a problem that could almost go down the performance route and then have to sort of backtrack, right? So there's this thing of early conversations during onboarding, during interview. It could be a real transformative thing. But to go back to the start, because your children must be the same age as mine nearly, right? Near as damn it, 18, 19, right? My wife and I started to learn, not for us, but for them.
Right.
I do what I do now, not ostensibly for anyone else, for them. Because I don't want them having 35 jobs, being sacked 30 times. I don't want them feeling that no employer understands them or will give them a shot. And I don't want them feeling that they are being pathologized in the workplace because managers think they've got to be clinicians. And, oh, you've got ADHD. Well, are you medicated? And when do you take? No, I want them to feel that they'll be treated like people. And that if they choose to say, I might need a bit of support, they know how to say it and that they may get that. That's why I do it. And I believe every late diagnosed parent eventually would say the same thing. The reason I think we see a lot of late diagnosed parents really flounder, though, and really struggle is in that period of grief where you've got to understand who you are. There's also a lot of looking back and going, oh, that's why that happened. And had I known, perhaps. And it's very important we do that, but it's also very important perhaps that at that point you can say to your employer, look, I've just had some information. You don't need to know about what, but it's big and it's life-changing. And I'm feeling a bit all over the place at the moment. It's a bit raw. So I might need to change what I'm doing for a day or two. I might need to not have those big planning tasks because my mind isn't able to process, right? We need to get to a point where people feel confident to say that. And we talk about mental health first aid all over the world. That for me is a part of that conversation, right? But it all links together. You fight for your children, you support your children, they point you to who you've been all along, and now you almost have to redefine you and you see everything differently. And that's big.
It's huge. And I can't believe we are at our time.
I know.
So Matt, you have a lot going on. I don't want to lose touch. I feel like we have more conversations. We have to unpack the children yet. We've just been unpacking the adults.
Yeah.
How can my listeners contact you if they want to hear more or get your support?
So LinkedIn is where I spend most of my time and where people find me. So you can just find me. My name is Matt Gupwell. So Gupwell. You can find me there. My business is called Think Neurodiversity. So that's the same on Instagram as it is on Facebook, and the same as it is on LinkedIn as well. And that's the website address as well, thinkneurodiversity.com. And then we'll talk to you on this as well. I have my own podcast that I run with a clinician over here called Talk ADHD. So people can go and check that out. And that's just where I get to pick the brains of another clinician who's an ADHDer and a prescriber. And we talk about all things neurodivergent there as well. So you can find me in any one of those means.
I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
So tickled that you accepted and that we had our conversation today. And I really look forward to many more to come. Yeah. I can't thank you enough, Matt.
That would be amazing.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Work Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.